Shall we first of all ask the panel to introduce themselves? Gabby, would you like to start?
I'm Gabby Darren from the University of Southampton, and I work also for the National Centre for Research Methods, NCRM.
Hi, I'm Sarah Leithwaite. I work on pedagogy and methodological learning. I'm a research fellow on the project with Mel, also based at the National Centre for Research Methods.
Richard Rogers, Professor of New Media and Digital Culture, and also the Department Chair of Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam.
Louise Corti, I'm one of the directors of the data service responsible for incoming data, but also lead the research data management team. So we're in charge of the data policy and getting everyone to share data and training around creating high quality data.
Hi, I'm a sociologist, Howard Davis from Bangor University, and I'm also co-director of the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research, Data and Methods, which conducts research in various strands, but also has an infrastructure and training and capacity building aspect, and I'm involved particularly in the training and capacity building.
Thank you. If John hadn't had to dash off to the RSS, we'd have England, Wales, Scotland and Europe represented around the table. You're personifying Europe for us here today, with an American something or other in there. Okay, so you may have a specific question for a specific person, or you may just want to put something out there and see who grabs it. I'm all right with silence.
It's the why now question. Why has it taken us until now to elevate the pedagogy of methodological learning as something to pursue?
Sarah, do you want to start?
I think obviously our project started, and there was a preliminary project before that. And I think it was quite interesting that there were two reviews of literature quite early, and Garner and anyway, two reviews of the literature, which described the lack of pedagogic culture, followed by a third, which Mel was involved in. We started to establish that actually there wasn't some emerging pedagogic culture. I don't know if I'd like to speculate on why or why now. In some senses, I think we're all aware that journals are publishing more than ever and more research is happening than ever before. So in some sense, I think we would hope to see education recognised in that space and research methods too. But I think there's also a question regarding what investments are being made, particularly in the UK, around research methods. And in some sense, it is a shame that, well, you might want to talk to the quantitative situation, because I think in particular there's been this knowledge that quants and mathematics at sort of lower levels in the UK have struggled in terms of raising graduate achievement and the methods that we need. I should probably hand over to colleagues at this point, but that's a sort of the place from the literature, is that something was starting to happen, but it always comes down to the funding to look at something in more depth and make the necessary changes. Gabby, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also coming from a sort of a German background as well, so obviously I've got this sort of, this sort of background as well, and having studied pedagogy and various things in Germany, I'm sort of familiar with pedagogy for mathematics, so I've grown with that, and I'm coming with that sort of, so I'm a little bit surprised to hear, oh, it's only happening now in a way, but certainly for the higher education sector, it's a different type of field, I suppose. So, I definitely think it's very, very important. And I think, particularly sort of from the higher education sector, I mean, teaching is always something that, particularly from a quantitative perspective, people start to think of, okay, we have to do it, but it's not necessarily something that is necessarily on their forefront. Some may enjoy it, but some see it as some sort of necessity, and I think it's a great shame. I think it's really, you know, maybe things will change in the future with the TED and other emphasis, that there will be more emphasis on pedagogy and teaching.
I mean, surely it's probably come out of the conservation methods crisis and recognising it as a big crisis, and everyone taking note of it being scaled up, and we then reflecting to say, well, what are we doing wrong? Maybe students coming out of dire and they're not skilled. We must be doing something wrong. Should we understand what we're doing? So I mean, my feeling is it probably has come out of that, the fact that we've, and it's really good that it has, but it's probably come out of the why we
And in NCRM, there's this happy coincidence of me being there as a methodologist and then going, actually, first and foremost, I'm an educationalist, and this dialogue that we're having about capacity building isn't going deeply enough, and I think that's been echoed all around the place, isn't it?
Can I say something? I mean, just coming from quite a different perspective. So I think the spur to increase interest in pedagogy around methods also comes from the data deluge of the past decade, let's say, where massive digitization projects in the humanities and in those sort of labs and galleries and libraries and archives and museums. So you're seeing there talking about a lot of data available, but then a sort of crisis in researcher use of archives, or so trying to stimulate students and scholars to get into the digitized collection. So that's one, and then secondly, of course, there is the rise of the automated software, right? At least where I'm coming from. So you have all kinds of quite simple things online, and where people can plug in data sets and make things that seem have outputs that seem very powerful, but are they correct? So I think there's a real need in teaching and coming up with a variety of different techniques, and I now have an increased vocabulary, a number of approaches and strategies and tactics, tasks for teachers to say. And then the final one is of course that you have the I don't know let's call it the kind of the funding or the larger programmatic push where there's increasingly funds certainly in Europe, but for digital on the digital data challenge or here's a data set or digital humanity, the rise of digital humanity, all these sorts of things where suddenly you have a lot of teachers in need of training, right? Yeah. So for me, it's those three things.
Thank you.
Just add one. I think there's a push for professionalisation, not because there's a crisis in quantitative methods everywhere. If we look at econometrics or social psychology, there's hardly a crisis. It's in particular areas, softer disciplines, perhaps, and for the other reasons mentioned. I think we haven't got that tradition of thinking very seriously about what professional qualifications are required both to research and to teach research. And of course there's an institutional pressure on teaching quality that we have to attend to as well.
Sort of building on those points, I think it's really exciting the sort of new methodologies going around. It's not that there's been a glut, but there's always developments in methodology, which I think is great. I think it's great that we're thinking about the pedagogy of teaching them, but I'm also aware there's a tension that the space given to teaching research methods is pretty much, from my experience, stayed pretty static over the past 15 years or so that I've been teaching research methods in terms of the number of hours if I have to teach students. So I guess my somewhat pithy comment will be, what do I drop to fit in all this new stuff, or do I leave it for the masters, or do I leave it for the academic staff? I feel like there's a separation from now the research literature that the students have been asked to read with all these exciting methods, and the methods they're being taught, which, like, I can't remember the last time I saw a paper that had a t-test in it. I mean, or whatever, because they're so much more complicated. And they're so exciting things, and they read these exciting methodologies, and we're still doing some of this basic stuff. So can I drop some of that and just, that's my pithy question, but the broader question, how do we fit it all in? How do we deal with that challenge?
Oh, it's terrible, I keep wanting to answer these questions. Oh, go on then. I just wanted to, as you were talking, Cardiff Q-Step was coming into my head, and then talking about nicking curriculum space from the subjects, because in Q-Step we're trying to get this statistical awareness and methodological competence across all these disciplines. So instead of just learning methods in that class, you're actually learning methods through your interrogation of that research paper in that sociology class or in that economics class or whatever. So they would talk very strongly about, yes, nicking curriculum space. As just one approach rather than just dropping things. Sorry, Michelle.
But I think the short answer is not necessarily only teaching methods separately. That's the message.
You're talking about practical things that they have to do in 10 weeks or 20 weeks. I mean, you don't have much space to do many things at all, but you can learn about the methods through exposure through the substantive classes, but when you're actually training and developing that method yourself, I think that's very hard. Maybe students could get a chance to pick whether you do a t-test or some big data analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing. It's like, are there bits that are a bit like Latin in an old curriculum that we just sometimes it's really at the time it was really important and they never wanted to drop Latin, but now we kind of feel like we can get by without understanding Latin. And I just wonder whether there are some bits that we're sort of historically stuck with. Are we more interested in kind of quantitative literacy and reasoning, and are they better skills for the majority of undergraduates who may not become data analysts? And do we think about some of those much more technical details of data analysts at some higher level? I don't know, I'm just speculating.
There's a flirtation at European universities with dropping philosophy of science as a required course.
Some booing around.
Flirtation.
But Stephen Ball in policy research would talk about how he'd come in, he would talk about a curriculum of dead white men, the school kids are brought up on this curriculum of people, who aren't very relevant to them. Maybe we've got this methodological equivalent, the t-test is the equivalent of.
Well, just to sort of jump in, I mean, I just wanted to sort of mention, just on the topic of t-test, I think it would be very difficult to drop the t-test and go straight into data analysis, because in any kind of data analysis, you're doing the t-test everywhere. So I think you need to be very careful what you're dropping, because if you're then, deleting the basics, you're not going to understand the more complex things. So one needs to be a bit more careful and vigilant as well. So.
John, I'm sure you'd have something to say. I don't know what this question was, but I can summarise it for you. It's around, methods, world is developing, methods are developing, but we seem to only have so much curriculum space. Do we drop some stuff?
My answer to that would be absolutely, because I think that given the limited curriculum space we have at the moment, what tends to happen is we try to teach too much and it simply turns students off because they don't get a good grounding in anything. We aspire to teach them a lot, but we end up teaching them less than we would if we aspired to teach them a little less. What you drop, I really don't know.
Teachers have been new.
Well, some people would argue, why bother with inference? Leave that till later. Get people used to the idea of understanding patterns in data. And the statisticians would get very twitchy about that. However, until people understand the potential and limitations of data, tests systematically mislead them because they think the data is telling them more than it can actually sustain. However, I also think it's a non-question in the sense that...
He asked it.
I'm phrasing that poorly, but I I've harped on for ages about the issue of curriculum space. You can't teach students quantitative methods in a 20 credit option. And the problem with the social sciences in the UK, I think, goes back to when they were set up and the model that was used to set them up, which really didn't pay nearly enough attention to methodology, nor to the kinds of curriculum that encourage students to think about methods. Beyond the question of methods itself, I think it's just the whole question of empirical evidence. Most existing social science degrees invite students to take the empirical evidence that's given and think about its interpretation. And that's not a credible position for a degree program to hold, in my view. But getting away from the current structure towards something that's more focused on empirical evidence, and as part of that is more focused on methods, is a long haul, because people are naturally wedded to the kinds of stuff they're teaching at the moment, nor do they necessarily have the skills to teach in a different way or to teach different stuff. So that's one of the reasons why QSTEC, the thing started with a massive recruitment program, 50 new posts. In that sense, it's a long haul, and so saying, I think it's important to have an idea of where we might ultimately want to be, but at the same time recognise, what are the limitations of where we are and what we can do with that. And I think there's a lot of merit in just getting students used to using data. And if they find that data interesting, they'll ask the questions about, well, how do you know when a pattern really is a pattern or just random variation? And then, the answer to that question drags you towards things like the t-test. We tend to do things the other way around. We say, okay, week 1, t-tests, and then invite the students to do all the intellectual work of understanding it, and then only at a much later stage do they get their hands on some data to see, what you might actually do with the t-test. And I'm exaggerating. I think there would probably be very few courses that would be set up like that. But if you look at any introductory statistics textbook, univariate descriptive statistics, bivariate descriptive statistics, inference, a whole chain of techniques, and usually very little sense of the application of them and why those techniques are important or why you want to use them. So I think sometimes we kind of we almost invert the order of our teaching.
We've got a question here.
I just found myself in complete agreement with you. And I'm in UCD in Dublin, and about 6-7 years ago, we had to go from having 4 full modules of stats plus 1 3 full stats modules plus 1 qualitative, and we had to collapse it down into 3 modules, 1 each year. And one of the positions we took was in first year, we just wanted students to be comfortable reading research. And more design than statistics, methodologies rather than analysis. I think the only stats they get is in the last few weeks we do mean, standard deviations, correlations, that sort of principle. Very simple. So we wanted them to be what some people call confident consumers of research, so that in their other modules where they're reading studies, they can get the language, they can understand. And then when they move into second year, then they've got a whole set of lab modules, and the methods module complements those by focusing again on what they need to understand conceptually to be able to engage in their labs. I think definitely that idea of diving straight into some of the tools of research design rather than the principles of research design, I think students can engage with better. And ultimately, if they can read research and judge it, that's going to be a key skill for everything that they do. So I just think that's to be able to take, as Paul was saying, more time with less content, I think is a really valuable thing to do. But then, I will have colleagues who are looking for good postgrads who are worried that they don't know how to do X and they don't know how to do Y. And I think sometimes it's better for them to learn some of those more advanced skills with their own data, whether it be final year projects, whether it be master's theses, minor dissertations, things like that.
Just to add on that, you talked about evaluating research, and I think it's really important for them to be able to evaluate data properly, because as we get bigger streams of data, it's not just about getting a known data set and analysing it, it's bringing exploratory data analysis right up front to make sure the data is fit for purpose. And we've lost a lot of those exploratory data analysis skills, because in the 90s you weren't allowed to do D-gate. because it wasn't hypothesis driven. So there's lots of methods that actually didn't encourage that, but now everyone, particularly in the big data, was going back to EDA because you need it to correct for errors. But I think having that play to make sure the data is fit for purpose and then moving to whether you're looking for correlations or causation is important. So I think it's really, evaluation science is very important.
Question here, Brett?
I mean, a general question really, it's another tension, I think. I mean, we've heard quite a lot today about quite advanced techniques, new techniques, digital techniques and so on, at the leading edge where the pedagogy addresses relatively small numbers of fairly advanced learners. What about the rest of it? And what was I was hearing in a lot of the other sessions, the parallel sessions, was the bigger numbers, the beginner students and so on. Does that mean we need a different pedagogy for those different kind of applications? Is there a pedagogy of large-scale maths teaching and one for the kind of smaller scale big teaching, or is it the same pedagogy?
Who wants to take it?
My view would be you can start everyone with one thing. It's really simple, reading a table from the newspapers, and then you can build up. So you can start, but as you get to a point at which you're probably going to lose them, they can be directed off elsewhere. But I'm sure everyone can start with the same few weeks of teaching, I would imagine.
I think part of the answer to both those questions is about how we build in progression, because at the moment, as far as I've seen in several university contexts, what tends to happen is, you get topics which are repeated year on year. They're supposed to be more advanced the second time or the third time, but students don't see it that way. It's a source of boredom, and we just need to be much more deliberate and careful about what we treat as the method. I think teaching students to be good critical consumers in the first year is a good principle, and then just making it more active as they go along, and then linking it to projects ideally. But we just have to be more efficient, and that would solve some of the problem about what do we drop. We might not have to drop anything if we can fit it all together more cleverly.
I have a nitty-gritty answer to the question, and it's something that I do in the curriculum, teaching these digital research methods using web data. Is that with the first years, I give them the data sets and they look at it manually. In the second year, they take the data set, might not be the same one, but then they look at it through software. The third year, they're allowed to create their own data sets and look at it through software. And then the fourth year, they're allowed to do their own project, where they choose the data, they choose the software. So there is this progression, exactly that. And then ultimately, and this is what I was mentioning previously, was that they ultimately conclude their degree program with the thesis and the rest of it. There'll also be this sprint where they'll have international participants and they'll be teaching them. So this is that's the nitty-gritty answer.
I think it's not just the size of class, it's also the amount of time you have with them. So I think I think there's a place for 1 hour lectures to groups of hundreds of students. It's not a bad way of getting across some basic information, but I think it's quite difficult to teach quants effectively just in a lecture format. You need some kind of workshop and small group teaching and peer learning alongside that. That's where the standard university timetable is totally unhelpful, because I think the idea that you can run a lab session on, say, using SPSS in an hour is nonsense. By the time you've got everybody set up and everything's working, the IT is doing what it should be doing, you're halfway through the hour. I think there's a lot of merit in longer blocks of teaching, 2 or 3 hours, or different forms of teaching where the students might all be in the lab doing stuff, but they're not actually getting taught. They're working on their own, but there's people there that can help them out when they get stuck. That kind of thing. We did a sort of experiment at Edinburgh. We took first year students in the summer, and over the course of 10 days gave them our master's level course in stats. So in 10 days, they went from nothing up to logistic regression. But they were working every day, 9 to 5, and they were completely exhausted at the end of it, and they really enjoyed it. Now, they were a self-selecting group of students. I'm not saying you could do that with everybody, but one of the things that I learned from that was if you can just get a sort of concentration of time, it's very useful in just developing that whole different mindset that you need to make sense of performance. And it's very difficult to develop that mindset in an hour a week over 10 weeks. You know, by the time you get to the second week, you're revising what you did in the first week because people haven't been thinking about it for the previous 6 days. And I think the standard university timetable is particularly unhelpful. There's a related issue here, which is the elephant in the room is the TEF. And aside from the mechanics of what the TEF will measure, which will almost certainly be awful, there's an almost more important point, which is TEF metrics will be provider-wide. That will encourage providers to standardize their evaluations, and to standardize their evaluations, they'll standardize the format of teaching. And that will be particularly unhelpful to teaching quantitative methods, and it's something we need to kind of watch out for and try and resist, but I think it will be very, very difficult to resist. And so the kind of evaluation cart will be in front of the teaching course, unfortunately.
I did frame this session as future looking, but I didn't really want it to be bleak looking. So has anybody got another question, Debbie?
So in an alternative universe, perhaps, my question would be, if you could, what would the teaching and learning of research methods look like if you could start again with where we are now with digital technologies offering us different spaces in which we can teach and learn? What would research methods pedagogy look like?
I would volunteer that in a way, what you do, Richard, you've started with a blank sheet. I mean, do you want to talk about when you developed your digital methods, you know, the sprints, the summer schools, did it come fully formed to you? Did you know that it was going to be using these kinds of new teaching styles, maybe imported from some computer sciences or industry, or did you consider more the kind of traditional 2-hour seminar lecture as a way into the space? How did you come to? Sorry.
I mean, some of the things that I found really important was, you know, the room, the tables move, the chairs move. There's not one single, you know, projection space that you can, can move it. However, we have multiple projectors. When you're doing group facilitation, there's always someone who needs to show something. So the idea of the project. So that's one element of it. The other element was we built. I mean, I don't know how sustainable this is, but we have sustainable. We've built our own tools, and so this is sort of the ideal world. So we built all of these tools, which we call situated software. So it's software for the situation to solve, instead of using packages, which of course is radical. And then the other aspect of it was that we and this is what came from previous work, is that we always wanted to work on urgent social issues, and we fill in the curriculum really late. So we have a winter school coming up in January, and it's dedicated to did the U.S. just elect a meme for a president? So it's about social media data, and so that's the urgency of it, and I think that's what drives a lot of the interest, and so then we have people who come and present those kind of problems, and that we try to meet their needs. So I didn't mention this earlier, but the other thing was that whether it's Amnesty or Greenpeace or these sorts of NGOs are in the upcoming, in the case of the election, it's a little bit more academic actually this time, because it's the people who want to try to predict elections with social media data. First, that's something sort of different, which of course has failed repeatedly. There are a few articles. There was one about the British elections that was quite convincing article, but anyway, all the other ones, the German ones, etc., weren't convincing. But in any case, so there's this audience, this inbuilt audience for the research, where we sort of produce these these outputs that we try to get into their PowerPoint presentation, so they then take them on board. So all of these sorts of things are how we filled in the blank slate.
The follow-up question.
Yeah, it's a follow-up question to the question actually. I think it's really important also who is to design this, because we heard in the morning about pedagogical content knowledge, and I think usually it's down to one person to design a course, and this could be either a social scientist, a statistician, a methodologist, or an educator, and it's really rare to find these different aspects together, which I think are important in designing something that will work now. It's a question, but
Yeah,
I
something
the
to
question.
sit on me now and say, I demand to have a piece of pedagogic advice from you, from your study. It would be around pedagogic teams. We should never be teaching research methods alone. It's that team dynamic. It's having the educationalist and the digital person and the tech person and the data person, and get them together to create a course, and then we're getting exciting. But all of us are limited as sole individuals, aren't we?
Although I think it's worth recognising that, as far as I'm aware, research methods is the only bit of the social sciences where people are teaching about pedagogy. There's not, theorists aren't having meetings about how do we best teach theory.
Although the journal Teaching Sociology has been going on now, hasn't it?
It has, but there's, if you look at things like workshops and people having the kind of discussions we're having here today, there's been a lot of work around how to teach quantitative methods and how to teach research methods. There's very little more general work going on. The people who are talking about how to teach are basically us. That discussion is not going on elsewhere in most of the disciplines, and I think that's quite important, and there's a positive sign for the future. In answer to your question, I think that the place to start is, where does data come from? Because that's what tends to get overlooked, and yet is in many ways the most interesting and most revealing question. So that, one of the things that's happening at the moment is that there are all kinds of new sources of data that have new possibilities and new problems. Students tend to start out with the idea that, we know everything. Because books are full of information that just effortlessly comes off the page. And yet, how on earth do we know everything? Just how difficult is it to find out even really quite simple things about the kind of societies that we live in? And I think if you can get students excited about that, then methods stops becoming that sort of boring bit of, it's the course that you have to go and do. you know, when you really want to be looking at gender or race or whatever. But if you pose the question of, you know, how do we know anything, and what kind of, you know, often really quite strong and dangerous assumptions are made about the quality of the data that we work with. So that's a way into students' imaginations.
Is there a problem with having teaching research methods as a phenomenon? Should we just be teaching research and then everything else fits in? Because I think research methods it gets squished and compartmentalised, but you know, other people are teaching history and philosophy of social research methods, approaches, but I think the word methods is actually quite limited and makes it sound more technical. Is if we could just remove the word and teach research skills, that's everything, isn't it? I mean, I think it would help.
I'm really sorry to finish, so I'm aware some people will have trains to catch.